This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. There is a specific kind of silence that only falls on the deepest winter nights. A stillness that suggests the world hasn't just paused, but has begun to fray at the edges. In this volume of Kaidan, we explore the threshold where the old year refuses to end and the new one demands a heavy price. From the rhythmic toll of an isolated mountain bell to the glitching clocks of a hollow mall, these accounts remind us that time is never a constant. Sometimes, when the clock strikes 12, something else strikes back.
Chapter 1. The Chapel of the Endless Toll. The Rule of the 100th Strike.
Sound carries differently in the mountains during the winter. The deeper the snow blankets the earth, the further the echoes reach down into the dark of the valley. I wasn't the only one listening to the bell tolling through the dead of night that New Year's Eve. But I suspect anyone else who heard those sounds from the other side isn't around to talk about it anymore. My family home is tucked away in the high country of the Colorado Rockies. I'd been living and working in Chicago, but I made it a point to head back every December because my mother asked me to. There's a small, isolated chapel called Greystone that my grandfather's family had supported for generations. And every year, I'd help out with the midnight bell ringing. The local pastor was getting on in years and needed the muscle. The chapel sat all by itself in a lonely notch between the peaks. The bell tower was a weathered timber structure, blackened by a century of storms, standing just behind the main sanctuary. The bell itself was heavy, ice-cold, and marked with strange, faded stains that looked like old handprints burnt into the metal. When you struck it, the sound was low and long, cutting through the freezing air like a blade. It was a tradition meant to wring out the burdens of the old year. That year was unnaturally cold, and the snow was piling up fast. Father Miller, the pastor, had a bad back and couldn't manage the heavy rope, so the job fell to me and a local guy named Caleb. The instructions were simple. Father Miller would call out the count, and Caleb and I would take turns pulling. We were to strike the bell exactly 100 times to see the year through. I remember how he pulled me aside, his grip surprisingly tight on my arm. "You have to stop at 100, not a single strike more," he insisted. When I asked him why, he paused for a long moment, his breath hitching in the freezing air. "Because the first 100 are for the living to count," he said. I thought he was joking and started to laugh, but looking at his face in the dim lantern light, there wasn't even a shadow of a smile. Chapter 2. The Toll That Wouldn't End. The 109th Strike. The ringing began. Father Miller called out the numbers one by one while Caleb and I took turns with the heavy rope. 30, 40, 50. The snow was falling harder now, and beneath the timber frame of the tower, a few locals stood with their heads bowed and hands clasped. 70, 80. At one point, Caleb leaned in and whispered, "Almost there." But right then, Father Miller's voice went thin. I couldn't tell if he'd lost the count or if his breath had simply failed him. 97, 98, 99. The tolling seemed to be swallowed by the freezing night. 100, 101. Around that point, the tone turned strange and heavy. We were pulling the rope, but the bell didn't ring out. It gave a dull, muffled thud, like there was something thick and wet pressed against the metal. 100, 102, 103. When we finished the final pull, Father Miller bowed his head deeply. "God bless you both," he whispered. "It's over." That should have been the end of it, but the bell kept tolling. A low, rhythmic thrum, boom, echoed through the valley. No one was touching the rope. Caleb and I stared at each other, our breath hitching in the cold. Father Miller scrambled up the wooden stairs to the bell deck, but he stopped dead at the top, frozen in place. "Who's pulling it?" he gasped. His voice sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. The bell was swinging on its own. It wasn't the wind. It was moving with a terrifying mechanical precision, as if an invisible hand was heaving the weight. 109. At that exact moment, a scream ripped through the air from the courtyard below. I looked down and saw the townspeople scattering into the blizzard, panicked and stumbling. Across the white snow, dozens of black shadows were stretching out. They looked like people, but they had no faces, just dark, hollow shapes swaying in perfect time with the bell. I looked back toward the bell deck, but Father Miller was gone. The platform was empty, yet the bell kept swinging. 110, 111. I stopped counting. Even when I clamped my hands over my ears, the sound vibrated inside my skull. The world turned into a total whiteout. I couldn't see the chapel, the people, or even my own hands. I must have blacked out. When I came to, the morning light was pale and cold against the snow. I saw something buried at the base of the bell tower stairs. It was a black coat, Father Miller. He looked peaceful, like he was just sleeping, but his hands were clamped tight around the bell rope, his knuckles white and frozen. The next morning, when I climbed up to the tower to check the bell, I lost my breath. The surface of the heavy metal was covered in handprints. Not just a few, but dozens, hundreds of fresh marks burned into the frost, as if a crowd had been clawing at it. There were no footprints in the fresh snow except my own. Grace Stone Chapel has been empty ever since. No one has replaced Father Miller. The people in town don't talk about who or what was ringing that bell that night, but I still hear it. In the dead of winter, deep in the valley, I hear those 100 strikes, and I feel like someone is still counting. 1, 2, 3. Chapter 3. The Security Logs. The Countdown in Reverse. Security Logs. I was working a temp gig as a night security guard at a suburban shopping mall. It was just a 3-day stint over the New Year's holiday. Usually, a professional security firm handles the contract, but they were short-staffed and had to bring in some extra help. During the interview, I jokingly asked the supervisor, "I hear night shifts in places like this can get a little creepy. Is there anything I should worry about?" He just gave me a grim look and muttered, "Oh, you mean that incident?" I wondered what he meant, but I didn't push it. New Year's Eve, 10 p.m. The mall was already locked down. The lights were dimmed to the bare minimum, and the heating had been cut to save power. My own footsteps were the only sound echoing through the massive, empty atrium. My job was simple: do a patrol every hour, check for anything out of the ordinary, and log it. I could keep an eye on the security cameras from the monitors in the office. All the clocks in the building were synchronized, controlled by a central computer system that kept them accurate down to the millisecond. I was about to find that out the hard way. 11:55 p.m. Outside, I could hear the distant tolling of church bells from the town square, marking the end of the year. The snow had started to come down hard against the skylights. I sat alone in front of the monitors, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. There were 12 screens in total: the food court, the cinema, the rooftop parking lot, and the basement storage. Every single one was deathly still. 11:59 p.m. I watched the digital clock in the center of the console. As it ticked from 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds to 0, every screen flickered to black. Static hissed across the monitors, and a second later, the time jumped back to 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 50 seconds. 10 seconds had just vanished. I figured it was some kind of system glitch, but then the numbers started moving again. 57, 56, 55. It was counting backward. I looked up at the analog clock on the wall. The second hand was sweeping, slowly, silently, in reverse. There was no sound, just the quiet, steady retreat of time itself. Chapter 4. The Security Logs. The Changing of the Guard. One of the monitors, the one covering the cinema lobby, flickered to life with movement. A man was standing there, dressed in a dark uniform. The mall was supposed to be completely locked down. I lunged for my radio, but all I got back was a wall of white noise. The timestamp on the screen read 11:59:40 p.m. The man was looking directly up at the camera lens. I couldn't make out his expression in the shadows, but his mouth was moving. I reached over and cranked the volume on the monitor's internal speaker. "I can hear you," a low, distorted voice rasped through the static. It took a few agonizing seconds for the realization to sink in. That was my own voice, but I was sitting right here in the security office. I hadn't set foot in the cinema lobby all night. Yet the man on the screen was undeniably me. The security patch on his shoulder was identical to mine. Even the jagged white scar on his left forearm was there. I scrambled to check the system logs, thinking it had to be a recording from a previous shift, but the computer insisted it was a live feed. It wasn't a playback. The version of me on the screen slowly raised a hand, pointing a finger directly at the camera as if giving a signal. At that exact moment, the clock behind him in the lobby froze at 11:58:00 p.m. Then, every light in the mall cut out, plunging the building into a suffocating darkness broken only by the dim, rhythmic pulse of the red emergency lights. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and headed for the stairs. The silence was so absolute, it felt heavy, like the air itself had turned to lead. Every sound I made was instantly swallowed by the shadows. When I reached the cinema lobby, the air felt different, colder and thick with the smell of damp concrete. I saw something on the floor, a pair of wet footprints on the tile, as if someone had just walked in from a blizzard. I followed the trail to the center of the lobby, right in front of the vending machines. My nightstick was lying there on the floor. I reached for my belt, but my holster was empty. I had no memory of dropping it. The moment my fingers closed around the grip, the mall's PA system crackled to life. 1 minute until the new year, a mechanical voice announced. But it wasn't the usual pre-recorded greeting. The voice was trembling, carrying a very human edge of pure terror. As the announcement cut off, the emergency lights began to flash in a frantic, jagged rhythm. I looked at the analog clocks on the lobby walls. Every single one had stopped dead at 11:59:00 p.m. But when I looked up at the security camera nestled in the ceiling, I saw it rotating toward me with a series of sharp mechanical clicks. Then a voice echoed directly inside my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. You are still in the old year. My body locked up. I forgot how to draw breath. I turned toward the entrance of the theater just as the massive silver screen inside flickered to life, casting a blinding white glare into the lobby. An image appeared on the screen. It was me. The version of me on the screen was sitting in the office chair back in the security room, staring intently at the monitors. In the corner of that projection, the timestamp read December 31st, 11:58 p.m. It was a live broadcast of where I had been only minutes ago. The me on the screen suddenly looked away from the monitors and stared directly into the camera lens, looking me right in the eye. He opened his mouth and whispered, "Time for the shift change." The moment the words hit me, my consciousness snapped like a dry twig. I woke up in the office chair. It was morning. Pale, cold sunlight was streaming through the high windows of the atrium. The monitors showed the mall in its usual, empty daylight state. The digital clock on the console read January 1st, 7:30 a.m. I desperately wanted to believe it had all been a vivid nightmare brought on by the isolation. But then I saw it sitting on the desk, the nightstick I had found on the lobby floor. I went to the wall to check my time card. It showed that I had clocked in at 10 p.m. on the 31st and clocked out at 11:59 p.m. that same night. I hadn't touched the punch clock. The next day, when the regular crew returned, I tried to explain it to the site supervisor. I started to tell him about the glitch with the clocks, but he just cut me off with a slow, weary nod. Every year, at least one person tells that exact story, he said, his voice flat and devoid of surprise. They all say time started moving backward, he said. He gave a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. The thing is, everyone who tells that story never shows up for work the following year. I guess this year it's your turn. I still hear the clock sometimes, a sharp, rhythmic clicking that sounds like it's moving in reverse. I don't think my time ever truly moved forward after that night. Sometimes I get the terrifying feeling that I'm still back there in the dark, trapped forever in the final minutes of the old year.
Chapter 5. The Double at the Midnight Service. The Grin in the Holy Water. That year, I decided to travel a bit further for the New Year's service. It was well past 1 in the morning, but the cathedral grounds were still teeming with people. As I passed through the heavy wrought iron gates, the glow from the street lamps reflected off the fresh snow, making everything look unnaturally bright. Stalls were lined up along the walkway, the scent of mulled cider and wood smoke hanging heavy in the freezing air. The distant sound of an organ echoed through the trees, mingling with the low hum of the crowd. I came to a sudden halt right in the middle of the path. There, moving through the crowd ahead of me, was a familiar figure. It was me. The same heavy wool coat, the same plaid scarf. Even the way she walked, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, it was identical. "Wait," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. The figure turned around. The face was mine, without a doubt. She was smiling, but the expression was wrong, stretched and twisted, as if her skin was being pulled too tight over her cheekbones. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to push through the throng of people. But the crowd shifted, a group of latecomers cutting me off, and she, or whatever it was, slipped away toward the stone fountain in the side courtyard. I ran after her. When I reached the fountain, the courtyard was empty. The only sound was the soft splash of water against stone. I leaned over the edge, looking for any sign of where she'd gone, but all I saw was my own reflection staring back from the dark surface. Except the reflection was smiling. I wasn't. My face was pale, my mouth set in a hard line of terror. But the woman in the water had her lips curled into that same distorted grin. Her mouth began to move, though no sound came out of my own throat. "I'll be seeing a lot more of you," she mouthed silently. I recoiled, my hands flying up to cover my mouth, and the water rippled. As the circle spread, more faces began to appear in the shifting waves. Dozens of me, all staring up from the depths. Each one had a different expression. One was sobbing, another was twisted in a mask of pure rage, and another stared back with eyes that were completely hollow. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the icy cobblestones. As I fell, my foot hit a piece of stiff paper lying in the snow. I picked it up. It looked like one of the prayer cards the ushers had been handing out at the door, but this one was different. My name was printed clearly across the top in dark, elegant ink. Below it, where a scripture or a blessing should have been, there were only 4 words. Destiny. No way back. Chapter 6. The double at the midnight service. The New Year's exchange. The cathedral's PA system crackled with a burst of static. "Thank you all for joining our service this evening," the voice announced. There was a brief pause, and then the same voice continued, though the tone had shifted into something hollow and mechanical. "We will now begin the departure of those from the year gone by." A sudden heavy movement rippled through the crowd. I looked around, and my heart hammered against my ribs. The faces of the people around me were dissolving into a white, hazy mist, becoming as smooth and featureless as blank masks. In the midst of that ghostly throng, the other version of me appeared once more. She was holding a prayer card, the one I was supposed to have. Dark, jagged letters began to bleed through the paper. "You died here last year," the card read.
She gave me a thin, chilling smile. But this year, I'm the one who gets to go out there. She reached out and seized my hand. Her grip was beyond freezing, colder than the mountain snow, colder than the ice at the bottom of a well. My vision began to blur into a dull white. A piercing ring echoed in my skull, and the world felt like it was receding into the distance. As the sounds of the crowd faded away, her voice remained, whispering directly into my ear. You think the first service of the year is about a new beginning? It's not. It's about taking someone's place. When I came to, I was standing alone in the cathedral courtyard. The morning sun was blindingly bright, reflecting off the fresh snow. I could see the ushers and a few volunteers in their heavy coats, sweeping the stone steps and tidying up the grounds. None of them seemed to notice me. None of them seemed to have any memory of the night's terrors. I looked down at my hand and realized I was clutching a small card. May the Lord grant you a blessed year, it said in elegant script. But beneath that, written in a sharp, blood-red line, were the words, "This year you have finally crossed over to the side of the living." Every year when I return home for the holidays, the memory returns. I find myself staring at the faces in the crowd, wondering who I really was that night. And I can't help but fear that if I ever see her again, I'll find out which one of us is destined to stay behind in the dark of the old year. We mark our lives by the strike of a bell and the turning of a calendar, trusting that time is a constant, steady companion. But these stories suggest that the transition between years is less of a bridge and more of a fragile veil. We assume we are moving forward, yet we rarely stop to ask what or who we might be leaving behind in the dark. Perhaps the echoes we hear aren't just memories, but the sounds of a reality we no longer inhabit. Thank you for joining me in these shadows. As you step back into the rhythm of your own life, take a moment to listen to the silence between the seconds. You might find that the world you take for granted is only one version of the truth.